Today I bring you video at request from good friend of mine named Vladimir. Uh, it, it, I do not want to call it a request. It was more of a proposition, quite frankly. But nonetheless, I plan to go through with it. I'd like to give a few words per my good friend Vladimir that I am to be more academic in my approach to video on YouTube. He does like YouTube, especially when it comes to bears and various other animals. But nonetheless, my goal here is to just keep my good friend happy because I don't like to upset my friends, quite frankly. But this particular video is not so much a video about various problems within architecture from Nvidia. More so because there really isn't one. I understand problems with third-party cards. Quite frankly, that is not a problem for Nvidia. So what I will be doing is trying to explain to you how graphic process units truly work, and in a sense also explaining how processors, microprocessors work based off of various types of what is word I look for? Acronyms used in various tech outlets. Not many, because most don't put out information for anyone to understand. They just want you to know numbers based on initial release, which in my country we don't release numbers, period, quite frankly. But yes, this is more so a educational explanation as to how things work. So Vladimir, thank you for giving me opportunity. I will not let you down. What's up, guys? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gregory Alexei. I am not a tech tuber or a YouTuber or a tech journalist. But yeah, this particular video is not really meant to be, the same old videos that you guys see put out, thrown out there, shoved down your face. As far as, just raw numbers in terms of rasterization, in terms of frames per second, which I know is very prevalent, especially to you gamers out there. But this video is more so academical, in a sense, which is something that I'm a huge proponent of, is understanding how things work. So, yeah, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with me, I'll just give you a quick background. I don't have, like pretty much most tech tubers, a degree in electrical engineering. I've been a mechanical engineer by trade for the last 14 and a half, 15 years. But I did start getting into computing and more so trying to understand how microprocessors work at the age of 4 or 5, which was 30 plus years ago. And it's something I haven't given up on. I've continued to research on my own time, and it is a huge passion of mine. So for those of you familiar with the past few videos that I may have used some terminology that just didn't make sense to you guys. So this video, in a sense, is more to explain those underlying terminologies, they're basically acronyms that are used within the industry, not in my industry, but yeah, that's essentially what this video is all about. So the very first thing I'd like to touch up on is GPUs. Well, essentially this whole video is going to be based upon GPUs given the nature of the tech community at the moment, particularly when it comes to Nvidia's new Ampere release, which some are calling it a disaster, they're calling it a flop. I get it. I am not here to regurgitate that same BS, particularly over the last few days that's been put out there about cards failing, especially when being overclocked. Those are primarily AIB cards, and they're very early generation revision AIB cards, and the AIB cards that I'm familiar with and the users using them, they're not having those same issues. So just that'll put your mind at ease, hopefully, in one way or another. I could only hope. But this is more so just to give you guys an idea of how the changes made within this particular architecture, as well as potential changes made within RDNA, being RDNA2, AMD's big Navi, will make a dramatic impact on just general rasterization as we know it. And the real, I mean, the thing is about rasterization, it's something that's been around for so long, and it relies off various APIs, not just DirectX, which is the most prominent of them all, but now we have Vulkan, we have a bunch of low-level APIs that can make better use of GPU resources because they're coded far more simply, as opposed to the SDKs that Microsoft puts out there for any game devs who are also responsible for making these types of architectures work. So I will be addressing essentially some of the acronyms that I've put out there in the past and various tech outlets, more so written, people used to use keyboards as opposed to just talking to a camera, which I still prefer to do. I'm not very well known on YouTube. Once again, not a YouTuber. If you guys look through the last 8+ years I've had this particular YouTube channel, you're not going to find a lot of tech content. That was a goal of mine 8+ years ago. It wasn't even a goal, it was just a thought when I started this channel. But seeing the confusion between people and people just touting simple benchmark scores without taking so many other factors into account as far as improvements in various architectures, which we have many more architectures coming up, including AMD's Zen 3, which I can't wait to touch up on. I'm really looking forward to that, as well as RDNA2. Not sure about anything in regards to RDNA2. I've done a lot of digging. I have nothing. I have nothing. Absolutely nothing. But that's something that we do discuss on our Talking Tech podcasts, which we generally do weekly, but the last couple of weeks I haven't done so due to personal reasons, but this video I felt needed to be made to get people to better understand the underlying dynamics of how these architectures work. So jumping right into it, we're going to look at a basic, and yes, I am going to use Nvidia as the subject to explain how GPU architectures work, because they all rely off what we know as SIMD. So here you're looking at this is technically a theoretical. I'm not sure if you guys could see my mouse cursor here, but this is a theoretical SM diagram, a streaming multiprocessor that I drew before the official launch and the official white papers from the Turing release. And I was trying to do it based off reverse engineering Volta as well as Pascal. As we all know, Volta was never a true consumer GPU. You could use it as a consumer GPU, I suppose, but really what I want to get down to here is people understanding how SIMD works. I'm sure you guys have either read it, maybe heard it from some tech tubers. Essentially, SIMD stands for single instruction multiple data. So when we look at any one of these fragments, or Nvidia refers to them as clusters or partitions rather. I call them fragments. I've been calling fragments for years, but they refer to them as partitions. Fragment, partition, same shit. Essentially, this is a single SM within a Turing GPC. And what we're looking at here is the split of integer and floating point units. Now, something that we always have to take into account is the warp scheduler. In terms of AMD, they call it the wave scheduler. Whether it's a wave or a warp, it doesn't matter. It's the same exact thing. Now, what we're looking at here, which is actually pretty similar to what we're looking at with Ampere, sans a few differences, which I will touch up on in a moment, is essentially the warp scheduler is able to dispatch, well, first off, you got to look at the instructions being fed to each and every individual TPC before they get down to an SM, and then the instruction cache is pushed through to the warp scheduler and then the dispatch unit, and then down to the operand, which actually assigns any given instruction, but they can only do so at a rate of 32 threads per clock. A clock is a single hertz. It's a single hertz. That's one capital H Z. So we got to take that into account. So being able to dispatch 32 threads per any given hertz, which would be 1 cycle per second, they're able to dispatch those types of instructions to any given subset or data paths, as Nvidia likes to refer to them as. And they have to do so in tandem, but you have to understand that really does come down to driver support as well as game developer support as to how to utilize these instructions per the pipeline. And of course, this still comes down to driver support from NVIDIA's end, and that's something that NVIDIA's proven time and time again, they do have a tendency to keep up on. But in this particular case, we're looking at how would these instructions be assigned? And that is truly the question. For you gamers out there, this is really what I'm trying to get across here. Primarily, games run off of floating point precision, and I'm going to pull up, I do believe this is Pascal. Yes, this is Pascal. They do primarily run off of floating point precision, but when it comes down to integer compute, which is something that we have long since kind of thrown to the side. I'm going to go back to the Turing diagram because that actually gives you a better idea. If you were to throw out, say, 16 floating point units, that's fine. I mean, within an instruction that's being fed into the pipeline, it could accommodate that. But the other 30, or the other 16 threads, rather, can choose between either integer, special function units, as Nvidia has aptly named them, or they may utilize their tensor cores, which is a mixture of matrix and very low precision mathematics that you'll see widely used in things such as DLSS. Guys, it's roughly, yeah, it's a little after 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm pretty damn tired. But yeah, integer units still play a role in this. And to understand SIMD, single instruction, multiple data, you have to understand that these things must be run in tandem. So if I'm going to pull up Ampere's SM, which is basically what most tech outlets are actually pulling, or touting right now. When you start looking at my pretty basic SM diagram of Turing, and now we start looking at Ampere and the changes therein, you could see the potential for improvement. There truly is a potential for improvement, especially on game developers' end. But ultimately, once again, that comes down to the game developer's end, because once again, using the hypothetical of running it at a single hertz, 1 hertz, 1 clock per second. That's, if you were to fill up all 32 threads, granted you had 32 threads of floating point precision, and there's various forms of FP32 precision. There's various ways that they could compute, especially in rasterization. It has to do so in tandem. So keep that in mind. So if you were to fill up both floating point plus 32 data paths, as well as floating point 32 dedicated data paths with the full 16 plus 16 floating point 32 precision, which is just basically peak throughput, sure, you will see a huge uplift in performance. But that's just not the way rasterization works. There are quite a few other things that games rely on other than just pure floating point compute. Though they generally do rely on it, integer precision still comes into play. You get a pretty good idea of how, because not much has changed outside of that. I mean, cache pools have changed. They've become far more efficient. The memory controller, of course, has become far more efficient, as well as their cache hierarchy. But once we start looking into some of these calculations, sorry, I lost my mouse cursor. This will be edited. So yeah, we do need to take integer computation into account because neither one of these architectures, being RDNA or Ampere, Turing, or any, it doesn't matter which company, they still rely off single instruction, multiple data. So when we're looking at this, you have to understand that if a dispatch unit or or more so a warp scheduler or a wave scheduler, is dispatching floating point units on top of integer units. They could only compute so much at a time, and they have to do so in tandem. So if you're taking up the entire floating point data path, but still need integer computation, let's say 10, 11 threads of integer computation, which integer computation is still very prevalent, and it likely always will be. I mean, it's basic math. It's responsible for quite a few things. Those things being addressing fetching data, floating point compare, min-max or processing results for floating point. I mean, they really do rely off one another for them to work. So once these compute units, ALUs, which in my opinion, they're no longer ALUs, and they sure as hell aren't CUDA cores anymore. Yes, it could create some problems, especially in early revisions of a new architecture. We saw it in Turing, and we sure as hell are seeing it today in Ampere. Though the uplift is there, I don't doubt that over time we will see increased performance just in sheer rasterization per driver updates, as well as game developer updates, depending on the game. Of course, it does come down to the game developer working with not just the APIs, but also the SDKs that Nvidia puts out there for them to truly optimize their particular games for any given architecture. And that's just the nature of the industry. So don't be so quick to write off an architecture based off of initial results in terms of just sheer frames per second rasterization. But then when we start diving into stuff like DLSS or even ray tracing, ray tracing is obviously become a very prevalent thing. Basically what Nvidia has been touting, and it's nothing new, it's something that's been around for a long time, is known as BVH. It's a bounding volume hierarchy. Essentially what they're doing is they are taking the geometry from a 2D standpoint, being a box. It's literally a bounding box. And they're using that to try to find a triangle. Here comes the 3D. And that's where essentially the BVH hierarchy comes into play. Essentially what we see as ray tracing today in games, we know it's not true ray tracing. True ray tracing is flat out path tracing, and you won't see that in real time in any game anytime soon at any playable frame rate, unless it's at a very, very low resolution. But even then, what's the point? But essentially what they're doing with this BVH, the bounding volume hierarchy, is they're trying to eliminate the various objects within this particular square using geometry, using a triangle, to try to figure out exactly where one single ray could potentially bounce off of without interfering with another object within that square, if that makes any sense. I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. And that's basically how Nvidia's been able to get away with their hybrid ray tracing so far. And AMD's going to take the same approach. Intel will likely take the same approach, because there's a lot of computation to go, or that goes behind true ray tracing. And that's something we need to take into account. I know a lot of people are writing it off like very quickly. Everyone is about frames per second and this and that. But understanding the complexity behind what it takes to actually render true ray tracing, path tracing, is extremely complex. And right now we're relying off BVH. But that's just the beginning of the discussion. So as we dive a little deeper into the concept of BVH, we kind of have to understand, well, you guys rather, is the fact that, you know, they throw these terms around like BVH traversal, which is literally just, it could go one way or another. It could hit something or not hit something. It could go left, right, anyway, but it's always from the z-axis. That's something to take into account. And this is, once again, you could call it marketing, but that's literally the way things are playing out right now in terms of ray tracing. But yeah, essentially that's just the way things are working right now. And I don't doubt with time, particularly with improvements that I've particularly seen in certain benchmarks at least, that contain ray tracing support, or DXR support rather. There should be massive improvements in time, but at the moment it really does come down to hybrid ray tracing. And that's something we're gonna see for a while, whether you like it or not. It's here to stay. Consoles are going to be using it because AMD is going to be pretty much powering every single console, and RDNA2 is already slated with their own proprietary ray tracing cores, though I don't doubt they will be using some kind of bounding volume hierarchy. Jesus, I'm tired. Anyway, guys, hopefully I was able to explain a few things. Sorry I'm just like a politician. That was actually kind of my goal, but it's been a very long week. I actually bruised my ribs, and it really hurts just to talk, let alone sit in this position, though this main gear chair is actually somewhat comfortable. And yeah. I also played the Joker, Joaquin Phoenix's Joker. For anyone that's interested, yeah, just look at my YouTube channel. I did a stupid video, makeup and all. And it really hurt to do the Joker laugh. But hopefully this gave you somewhat of an idea of some of the acronyms used per certain tech outlets. Most don't actually delve into this kind of stuff. I intend to when I'm far more rested. I honestly haven't slept all week. Well, I have slept, but it's just a few hours here and there due to my ribs hurting like hell. But yeah, guys, hopefully you guys take it easy. Hopefully you guys can learn something. So for the next time you guys are reading a in-depth tech article, I'd highly recommend looking into more old school tech sources such as AnandTech, Ian Cuttress, or Dr. Ian Cuttress, sorry, Ian, and Ryan Smith do fantastic articles, very in-depth, very informative, and they're very analytical, which is something that I'm personally, I'm very analytical, being a mechanical engineer. But yeah, this is political season here in the U.S., so I decided it would be funny to dress up somewhat like a politician, though I don't think politicians have long hair. But that's going to go on November 1st regardless, because I'm tired of it, though I miss my beard. Sorry, Joe Stepanzi, or Stepans, Slacker. The beard had to go, because the Joker's in. Alright guys, hopefully you guys learned something. Take it easy.